Bellator president Scott Coker told the media this week that rumors about a possible merger with another promotion, possibly the PFL, that they're true. So here's Big Daddy Cokes talking about the situation. We've been out there.
I can play the clip, George. Yeah.
There's been a lot of talks too about a sale. Any truth to that sort of those reports?
Yeah, listen, we've been out there, and Bellator has been looking to take a partner, and that's really Viacom's been handling that. So we'll see where that nets out. Really, it's we'll probably have some clarity in the next 60 to 90 days.
Any truth about the PFL rumors?
They're definitely in the conversation. So there's a couple conversations going on right now with Viacom and a couple companies, and PFL is definitely one of them.
Great, thanks.
Our own Nolan King pitching the questions there to Big.
Great questions. Great questions.
Yep, exactly. So look, even Dana White has hinted about these rumors a few weeks back. As you hear all this, let me ask the fan in you first. What do you want to possibly happen, and what do you think will happen? Because they've talked about a partnership, possible some equity, or PFL outright buying them. Even one championship got thrown into this mix. But so the fan in you, what would you guys even want to happen? Let's start with Goes on this one.
The fan in me says right away, yeah, hell yeah, let's do this, right? I mean, if you're a big mixed martial arts fan, think about how much of your time was spent this weekend. There was PFL, it was Bellator, there was UFC. That is a lot of time and a lot of days invested in watching the sport. If you're going to take one of them days out and just give me a more stacked card between a Bellator and PFL, I'm totally in on something like that. Now, as you start to sit down and think about it a little bit more from that fan perspective, these cards are going to be a little bit more stacked. And isn't that kind of what keeps these guys out of that pay-per-view realm, right? Is sometimes the cards just don't add up. Every now and again, you have one. If they become more consistent on pay-per-view, now you're asking me to dish out money for UFC, Fight Pass, BKFC, ESPN Plus, the occasional boxing. And now on the regular, I might have to add a couple, 4 or 5 more pay-per-views per year. That part might suck a little bit, but really your mind can get blown when you think about some of the possibilities of what can happen here. Is it that you love the PFL season format and it becomes something bigger with that? Or do you like more the Grand Prix that happen at Bellator? Or do they do both? I don't know. I mean, the sky's the limit there, but as a fight fan, I think you could get pretty happy about some of the things you could do here.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about you, Nolan? What are you envisioning as a fan that you would like to happen between these two powerhouses if they were to get together?
Yeah, I mean, as a fan, I would love to see it. I think it spices things up a bit. Bellator has been, I think the biggest thing that's hurt them has been being on Showtime, just because people have to shell out that extra money. Whereas now, depending on how they structured with the merger in terms of pay-per-views or regular, ESPN Plus or ESPN shows, I do think overall it would be much more accessible for people to see, the Bellator fighter, the current Bellator fighters compete. I think that, as we talked about at the end of last year, Bellator, in my opinion, has a pretty clear-cut number 2 in terms of the talent pool, but their biggest enemy has been behind that paywall. So I think that would be exciting for the fans that buy ESPN Plus to pretty much solely watch the UFC. Like, it would be more of a reason to suck them into, the PFL product, or whatever you want to call this, PFLator, as I think Mike called it, this new product. So I think that would be great. I think that some of again, would depend on, there's so many questions that would remain about what a merger would mean, right? Would they still stick with the season format? Would they go for pay-per-view? Would they go for fight night sort of things? Would they do, a season and then regular cards? It's really hard to say. But I think overall it would just make things interesting. It would make things, you'd have those crossover fights potentially that we always talk about, but have never actually happened. So I would love it, honestly. I think it would be very interesting times in the MMA world. And I think that the fact that Scott Coker brought it up, and we're not brought it up, but Scott Coker openly talked about it and openly talked about PFL last week and mentioned a specific timeline, which I thought was interesting. If I had one more follow-up, if it had come into my brain, I would say, why did you say 60 to 90 days? Is that some sort of timeline you're being given? Is there already something in place? The fact that he acknowledged PFL makes me think that there's a pretty strong likelihood that it's going to happen. So I'm excited to see what happens. And I think this whole merger would be something that would be pretty historic for MMA.
That would have been a great follow-up. You must have been thinking about that deep dish Chicago pizza you were going to smash next. So we'll give you the pass. All right, Mike, that's brilliant, by the way. PFL-ator. I like it. What's your take on all this? What are you hoping, man, that the PFL roster goes this way, the Bellator roster goes that way? What format? What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? That's all the unknowns that we could get excited about. Would they even do that, right? Would they try to keep it two different entities and maybe just have like a fighter come here, make a fight there that's crossover? They can call it co-promotion when it's really under the same umbrella, more or less, maybe try to make it feel special that way. I don't know. I definitely like kind of what Go said, like if we could combine the two and have maybe less shows or like a median, put the mean in terms of like number of shows and boost the quality, all that kind of stuff, like that would obviously be good for people like us who get grinded to a pulp with the insane MMA schedule like we just had, this past weekend, for example, with UFC, PFL, and Bellator all putting on shows. Like it's just kind of never ending and so much going on and hard for anything to feel special or different or stand out. So I assume if they do make this happen, obviously PFL or whatever kind of brain trust or money, financial support that would come from their end would be like the shot callers. And they clearly feel that their brand is better than what Bellator is doing in most, if not all areas. So if I'm just guessing, smartest thing to do would be like to pick the best fighters from Bellator and bring them over, right? And if you have to cut bait on some of the lesser guys and move on from them just to strengthen one roster, like that would seem like the best thing to do. But I would be curious, how would a Patricio Pitbull feel about doing the season format with like all those 4 fights in 1 year when he's already done the format tournament Grand Prix thing under like 2-3 different regimes over in Bellator. So that would be the stuff that would be tricky. Would they reserve guys like that for like their pay-per-view super fight series? I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns, but it is exciting. Talking about this gets my blood flowing and my juices going a little bit more than just being like, hey guys, like you stoked for Bellator 298 or 2023 PFL 7? Like this is more exciting to me, so we'll see where it goes.
And think about too how tense, like say that a merger does happen, and I know this was the case, I believe, with the UFC Strikeforce deal as well, though that was a little bit before I started kind of covering the sport in this sort of way. But like, how tense would the last few Bellator events be for some of those guys on the prelims, right? Like Mike said, they're probably not going to bring the entire roster over. Maybe they would, maybe I'm wrong, but to me, like, I think you would see some guys that are like, you would look at a card and be like, damn, like 7 of these fights, like these guys are probably fighting for their job. So, that wouldn't be, obviously that's not like an ideal thing to root for, but it just would add the pressure, the high stakes to those sort of events. The last few would be pretty fascinating. Who's going to be the final Bellator champion ever? I would assume they would have used the PFL name. Maybe they'll go with Mike's suggestion of PFL-ator, but man, there'd be so many things to get us talking I think it would bring in a lot of eyeballs of people that don't watch these promotions too. It would just create such a buzz that it would be unavoidable for people that are into MMA.
I don't think they could do the regular season and the playoffs anymore. I think they would have to come up with Grand Prix that can possibly take longer than a year because there'd be too much talent coming over. But they would gain a middleweight division,
both, right?
Yeah. You could
gain a middleweight division. They would gain a bantamweight division. We now have Cyborg versus Kayla, very possible. I think some of the Bellator fighters that don't make it over are now possible Dana White Contender Series or that series that PFL is doing. Mm. So, I don't know. I'm thinking of some of the positives that can come out of this.
Well, and I think the interesting thing is, right, like all that stuff they could figure out. It's just like, how do they make money from something like this? Their money back, and I think it's from pay-per-view, right? And we see Trey and Scott Christian in the chat being like, if they do a pay-per-view, are you buying that event with PFL and Bellator fighters? How much would it be priced? Stuff like that. I mean, definitely there's more legs to it than there would be before, right? Like whatever PFL pay-per-view is happening next, Francis Ngannou most likely in the main event. And then from there below, I mean, you can mix and match talent and you could do a lot more that would be interesting and worth your money than just a PFL pay-per-view from their roster they have now. I mean, Francis Ngannou in the main event, Cyborg versus Kayla Harrison in the co-main event. throw whatever else you want on there. I'm buying that right away, whether it's $50, $60, $70. So can they get repeats of that? Can they draw interest in the next pay-per-view after that one? Those are where the big questions in terms of like longevity and all that stuff start to come in.
Yeah. And just even saying that, I think is like, think about how far like PFL's come to a certain degree. Like when they were World Series of Fighting and they didn't really have an identity, and then we're like, oh, they're changing their name, and they did a couple of events. And then we kind of thought they were on the ropes there for a while. And so I think there's some accomplishment here from both sides to be able to, maybe the first time that we've ever been on a show like this, where I can say that a promotion could put together a pay-per-view that would be worth buying, like 100%. You know what I mean? If you have me pay 50, $60 to see a bunch of champ versus champ Bellator-PFL fights with Cyborg and Harrison on there, whatever, and Ganu, like that's the sort of thing that I can't think of another time since I've been following this, that there's been a card that could be put on in full, not just one fight, that would be worth that amount of money to a consumer, at least for me, the consumer and me. So that's big within itself. But Mike said, like, what is going to be the next thing? How do you keep people there afterwards? That's going to be tough, if not very unlikely that they can do that.
Pro Fights Info says, I think it would be cool if they allow the season format for those that want it. Keep the Grand Prix alive and then do the regular UFC Bellator format shows from time to time. I was thinking, okay, the ones that do choose to be in it, they can do it. And at the very end, I guess whether you win the million or the million and a title shot, that would be nice. And then the other ones, the veterans that don't want to do a tournament, they just kind of compete at a different pace, right? But I think they could find a way to maybe make both of them work. That's a good point by him. A lot of ideas. But guys, doesn't it sound like, and I hate to speculate, but doesn't it sound like if anyone's buying anyone, it is PFL buying Bellator? Right? Yes. I mean,
I mean, Coach Scott kind of bounced around the word. I think he used the word partner, which again, I don't know if that was like a PR sort of thing, or if it was accurate, if they're not going to actually own them, if they're going to, because I think he said afterwards in the press conference that, you know, Viacom would still be involved somehow, which I don't know exactly how that whole thing would work out. So I guess time will tell, but it's certainly an interesting thing to try to predict.